Thanks so much for that generous introduction. It's always interesting to hear your life flash before you. And I imagine that is, to some extent, what artists feel when they begin to realize that a survey of their work will be presented. They begin to work with us curators on organizing that. And I know it must be very emotional to re-encounter works, some of them long gone from the studio, decades gone from the studio, and they come back like old friends. And that is, in a way, I think what Martin himself was experiencing over the last 2 days as we celebrated him and inaugurated his exhibition that just opened upstairs. And that's what brings me here today. So this is the third in a series of contemporary lectures presented by myself and other colleagues from the Department of Contemporary Art around our current projects here at the MFA Boston. It was a real gift that I was given when I arrived here in Boston 2 years ago, almost exactly, realized, and knew that was told that there was a Martin Puryear project on our calendar for this autumn. And my predecessor, Rachel Turing, one of the co-curators of the show, who left Boston to move back to his native Switzerland, would still be involved in the project, but that they would need someone here on the ground to bring it to fruition. And so it was with great joy that I began to work on this show together with Rachel from afar, and our other co-curator, Emily Liebert, who's a curator at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And it's to Cleveland the show will travel next, and after that, in the autumn of next year, to the High in Atlanta. But the story starts a little bit even before that, with Puryear's incredible pavilion for the United States at the 2019 Venice Biennale. I'm showing you a slide here of what you encountered as a visitor approaching the pavilion. He titled the show Liberty, Libertà, Libertà being liberty in Italian, and thought, I think, as he was building that project, a lot about liberty and freedom and what it really means at a moment that we all found ourselves in 2019. It is, like so often it is, a moment we still find ourselves in today. And so it's with even more urgency, I think, that we can look at work from this moment, which is really special, really meaningful, and I think also really illustrative of Martin's project more generally. So part of the proposition for Venice was, as many artists have done in recent years, to have some kind of incursion not only inside the pavilion itself, but on the outside of the building. And so when you approached the US Pavilion in the gardens of the Biennale, you encountered this screen, almost like a rood screen in a church, which he calls monstrance and volute. And the larger title for this work, and I'll show you the reverse, the volute part, right, is called Swallowed Sun. Going back to the monstrance part, and I love the wordplay that often happens in Martin's titles. Monstrance sounds a bit like monster, doesn't it? You have a two-dimensional version of a perspectival drawing of a dome. And we're reminded, of course, that the architecture of the US Pavilion is modeled on Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's plantation house in Virginia. More on that in a second. And that coiled behind that rood screen of sorts, with its blank staring eye, is a coil of black fabric and wire that curls up like a snake almost behind. The effect, of course, is also to screen off the entrance, to change the architecture in a way, to render a three-dimensional space in 2 dimensions, and always thinking about the ways in which architecture, has a lot of bearing on the ways in which we live our lives, or see things, or understand space. Just like the US Pavilion, just like Monticello, it has 4 columns in front. And here's the western facade of Monticello near Charlottesburg, Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, our 3rd president, right, a co-author of the US Constitution, worked on his estate, on his plantation, for some 40 years, adding to the house, changing the landscape. And of course, it's here that he was one of the largest enslavers of the state, or the Commonwealth of Virginia. The plantation grew tobacco and other crops using that forced labor. And therefore, it's rather curious in a way that we continue to honor this site as perhaps the United States' most famous house, right? It appears on versions of our nickel, 5-cent coin. And Jefferson himself is, of course, his portrait appears on our money as well. Here I'm showing you the facade without the monstrance and volute, as it was built in the late 1920s by Delano and Aldrich, a famed Beaux-Arts architecture firm in New York City, just at the height of the Great Depression, right, 1929. And interesting, of course, that the government, the State Department, who runs our operations at the Venice Biennale, chose this kind of iconic architecture, and the architects went with that kind of iconic American Jeffersonian architecture based itself on kind of Palladian and neoclassical precedents as the sort of official symbol of this country in a garden full of pavilions from other countries, each with their own distinct architecture. And you see here too, there is a little dome, right, with an oculus at its top. That's the monstrance, the place that lets in the light, just like in the Pantheon in Rome, right? Just like in Monticello, where there is a sort of space underneath the dome in this octagonal format, with a monstrance, an oculus looking up to the sky, just as there is inside the US Pavilion, where a visitor to the show encountered the work of art that Martin installed at its core, a work that is perhaps one of his only interior site-specific works, made specifically for this space, and made not to honor Thomas Jefferson, but rather Sally Hemings, one of the many hundreds of folks that Jefferson enslaved at Monticello, and with whom he had fathered at least 6 children. The work, as it appeared in Venice, was beautifully carved out of wood. The bottom poplar part painted, marbleized with paint to look like a fluted column that gradually tapers into a kind of waist. And then atop, a rather jarring juxtaposition with a wooden carved shackle that plunges into the base. This amazing, difficult, and beautiful poetic work of art lied at the core of a fascinating installation in Venice. And so it's probably not surprising that a number of the recent works in our survey here also come from that same pavilion. Here outside of the entrance to the suite of galleries that house this exhibition, the first work one encounters is a work called Aso Oke, which also appeared in that US Pavilion in Venice. It was made in 2019, first using very beautifully bent pieces of rattan that had been tied together with jute rope in the form of a hat called a filo gobi. This is a traditional headwear in sub-Saharan West Africa, particularly in Nigeria, where depending on the wearer's status, is folded or slouched in different directions and with certain prominence. This hat-like form is larger than life in Martin's conception. And it carries with it, too, so many of the tensions one sees throughout the work over many decades. It is both closed and open, right? You could see through it. It is transparent, but it still describes a volume. It is both dark and light. The beautiful black patina that he's chosen for it allows some of the bronze in which it's now been cast to gleam through, just as the light can pass through the piece through the holes in the sort of cage-like form. It is both sort of intimate in the ways in which it describes something that one might wear, and also larger than life. It is something one could almost get inside of, like a vessel or a house or a hut, if there were only a door. And so this cage-like form speaks so eloquently to so many different things, and I think points the way in which Martin himself might want us to consider the work. And that's from so many different angles. It's not just a hat, it's not just a cage, it's not just an abstract form, and it's not wood and jute at all, right? It's metal now. And so all of these interesting conundrums and contradictions are alive and breathing all through the work, as you will be able to discover as you see it in the galleries. The other work that greets you just as you enter the exhibition, and that was also in the Venice Pavilion in 2019, is a work he made just the year before called Hibernian Testosterone. It is a 12-foot wide sculpture that hangs on the wall like a hunting trophy might. And it is not bone, but rather cast aluminum painted a bony white and mounted on an upside-down cruciform shape made in beautifully carved red cedar, or cypress, sorry. Hibernia is what the ancient Romans called the island of Ireland. And it's there in the British Isles that a prehistoric beast once lived called the Irish elk. Here I'm showing you a fossil in a kind of natural history museum setting where you might encounter it. The 19th century paleontologists who unearthed its fossilized remains were rather shocked to discover that this strange, oversized deer once had roamed the British Isles and had actually managed to survive, or maybe not, with 12-foot wide antlers. They speculated at the time that its extraordinary production of testosterone, that which of course made its antlers grow so big, was exactly what led to its demise, its kind of toxic masculinity, making it impossible for it to even hold up its own head. It's a story Martin loves. It's a story that is perhaps apocryphal, because I think there's been much ink spilled over the years on how this majestic creature, or silly creature, depending on how you look at it, did or did not survive changes in climate and its habitat. Of course, it is no longer with us, and its toxic masculinity now consigned to history, and its remains in this beautiful, ghostly white form are Martin's. He, instead of, as he always does, rather than using technology, for example, to take a 3D scan of an existing fossilized head of the Irish elk, he instead very dutifully hand sculpted this in the studio using plaster, and then had that plaster cast in aluminum. And so, like everything Martin makes, it has had his hand in it in some of the most intimate and beautiful ways. It is also, for me, a symbol of how much the artist reveres the natural world and all of the creatures that live or once lived in it. He was a frequent visitor to the local public library where he grew up in Washington, D.C. He loved it so much that he ended up working there as a teenager. And it's there that he encountered so many of the books about natural history, about biology, and about art that fed his brain in those early years, that made him realize how much he wanted to be an artist, even at a young age. And it's also in the pages of those books that many of the forms we encounter in the work perhaps have their origins. Early on in the show, we also have on view a beautiful drawing from 2003 done in graphite, which repeats perhaps a kind of hat-like form, perhaps the spiral-like shell of a nautilus, perhaps the kind of thing that happens when you calculate the Fibonacci series, right? The kind of mathematical formula that is so generative for so many naturally occurring forms. But it is also a reminder for us that the work is always kind of spiraling in on itself, repeating itself, the same forms, the same subjects, the same materials returning again and again throughout the years. There's also, I think, a wonderful contrast that we find early on in the show, having placed Hibernian testosterone and aso-oke, the Philogobi hat work, towards the beginning of the show, to contrast in a way with more abstract forms, like the one you see on the right here in this installation view. It's a work called Self from 1978, a kind of primordial form made in beautifully carved and molded red cedar planking that's been very dutifully cut into gores and assembled as if you might a canoe, and then capped with a beautiful solid top of mahogany. And, you know, pictures never do Martin's work true justice, because you don't quite get the sense here, although I'm thrilled that you can just go upstairs and see it with your own eyes, the beautiful grain of the wood, the way in which the finish, maybe just like the finish on aso-oke, has been made just transparent enough so that you still read the grain of the wood, the seams where the work was assembled together. And then as you move around the work, its shape changes. It becomes like a humped back beast of some kind, as if it's about to stand up. It can change into a slender column depending on the angle at which you view it. And this morphing form, just like a body itself might change and move as it moves through space, begins to activate you as a viewer in the ways in which contemporary sculpture can be so engaging. We remember that Martin is of a generation where large-scale sculpture became dominant. He is just 2 years younger than Richard Serra, who was one of his teachers when he went to Yale University School of Art in the late 60s and early 70s. But of course, Puryear's work differs so much from his contemporaries like Serra, like Donald Judd, who so often had their works produced, right, for them based on maquettes they had made, their factory-made works by design, right, in order to distance the artist's hand a bit. But they are works that occupy our space just as Martin's do, and I think the contrast there between the truly handmade and the industrially made is always present in Martin's work. They are so handcrafted that it is miraculous to, I think, a viewer who is so used to machine-made forms all around us all the time. The artist's education is a fascinating one, and he was already, so self-taught in terms of so many fields like biology, like natural sciences. He did attend Catholic University, also in Washington, in the early 1960s, and then in 1964 went as one of the first generations to go into the Peace Corps in sub-Saharan West Africa in Sierra Leone. And he was there from 1964 to 1966. This is a miraculous time in many places, certainly in Africa, where the liberation from colonialism of many of those countries was underway. And here, of course, in the US, was a time of upheaval in the civil rights movement. And so I think his experience was very inflected by that exciting moment. It's also in Africa that he encountered so many types of art making that have remained with him throughout the years. Everything from how special fabrics are woven by artisans there, by how huts' roofs are thatched, and by how certain woods are worked by masters of their craft. It's a kind of craft knowledge that he brings back with him and then brings to his work at Yale. And then after his time at Yale, he goes to Stockholm, Sweden, to go to the Royal Academy of Arts there and study printmaking. Sorry, actually, that was right after Africa and before Yale. So coming out of traditions of printmaking and then seeing so much woodworking in Sweden, there are the ways in which those kinds of form building through kind of craft ways appear in the work so much. And I'm thinking in particular of a work here called Bauer from 1980, which seems at once like a kind of hat-like form perhaps, but also like some kind of wonderful basket, put together so beautifully, made out of beautiful, slender pieces of spruce and pine that are then tacked together with wonderful shiny copper tacks. It is also a bit of a cage, a bit of a basket, a bit of a body. And those kinds of forms with this wonderful sloping back, almost maybe like the back of a head, are also all throughout the show. I've spoken already a bit about the natural world and the ways in which it manifests in this artist's work. And one of my favorites in the show, I'm a bit biased because it's here in the MFA's collection, is a little sculpture that sits on the floor called On the Tundra. It was made in 1986, first carved out of wood by the artist, and then cast in iron. It had its first appearance, actually, here as well at the MFA in just sort of right around above us in the Foster Galleries on the first floor, where you see it here on the right, in the bottom right corner, as part of an installation for his show Connections, Martin Puryear, at the Museum of Fine Arts in 1990. That's a show that was curated by Kathy Hallbreich, one of my illustrious predecessors here, and in which artists were asked to respond to works in the MFA's collection to build their project. You see another kind of cage-like form there in the middle of the installation, and that's a structure that Martin had based on a yurt, right? Those dwellings, portable dwellings made by folks in the steppes of Asia. And the idea that this kind of thing is transportable is also such an interesting thing for an artist who himself has been so peripatetic, who has spent so much time in so many different places in the world. The idea that something can be both permanent and portable is perhaps also evoked by the very form of On the Tundra, because it takes cues from the artist's love of falcons, and in particular, the gyrfalcon, the largest falcon of them all, who Martin had discovered very early on in his childhood reading at the library of John James Audubon's Birds of North America. He had always remarked on the case of the gyrfalcon because, as Audubon dutifully illustrated in the 19th century, they come in two different colors. The ones from Labrador are black, and the ones from across the Atlantic, from Greenland, are white, like the snow of the northern tundra. And the idea that a species could be so mutable in its color, and it was remarkable to the young Puryear. So much so that when he came across a marvelous work also in the MFA's collection on a visit in the 1980s, he was struck by this extraordinary drawing, a portrait of a gyrfalcon by the artist Mansour. Mansour was a treasured employee of the Mughal emperor Jahangir. And so when Jahangir was gifted a gyrfalcon, sometime in the early 17th century, he asked Mansour to illustrate this regal beast. And here you see the beautiful folio page where Mansour dutifully captures this majestic creature. And it's remarkable to think about the journey this beast must have made, because of course they're not native at all to the Indian subcontinent, nor even to Persia, from whence it had probably come as a gift to the emperor. And so the bird, just like the artist, had traveled long distances to get to where it was, and had to adapt to new climates and new experiences. And so it's with that beautiful idea that of a regal creature from the animal world that Martin began to make this sculpture and thought that it would be the perfect thing to add to his show here at the MFA. Those bird-like forms pepper the show because it's a form that has occupied the artist over many, many decades. And so all the way back some 40 years to the mid-1980s, and then here in the early 2000s, there on the back wall, you see another one perched as if it's on a little branch of some kind. And it's here in this next room of the show that we encounter more forms that Martin had then begun to make at his new studio in the Hudson Valley. And it's there that he has been most permanent after stints in Nashville, Tennessee, in Chicago. It's there he moved in 1991, and it's there he's stayed ever since. And it's there that he made another great work that's in the MFA's collection called Confessional. From this vantage point, it might look like Confessional is some kind of little house, and I'm thinking again of that yurt that can be transported. Maybe it's the shape of a covered wagon of sorts, and there are wagons and carts and wheelbarrows and things on wheels all throughout Martin's oeuvre, as if he wanted to remind us of his peripatetic existence, of the ways in which there is so much migration, so much forced migration in our history and even today. Is it also perhaps a confessional box, right? That kind of way in which the tar-covered wire mesh that forms most of its skin is both transparent and obscures what's inside, almost as if you had entered into a space where you could almost see through but can't quite access. I'm reminded too again of the fact that Martin is always creating beautiful volumes that are both available to you as a viewer, but not quite. It is a space you can almost enter visually, but not physically. Is it also perhaps, again, another one of these forms that mimics on a large scale somebody's head? Do you begin to see a face where the door might be? And do you begin to see the back of a head into someone's sloping neck at the back? And I wonder to what extent we think about this work as holding all of those things together. A thing that can transport you, a thing that might hold a mind, a thing that you might enter to have some kind of conversation or confession. How much can you enter this work? How much do you need to stay outside of it? The beautiful poetry that Martin's forms evoke and Martin's materials evoke are always visually stunning, and I think they reach a real apex in the last gallery of the show. You'll see there a newer version of the column for Sally Hemings, more on that soon, but there in the background, another hat-like form and another face-like form. And that face-like form is a work called CFAO. That stands for Compagnie Française de l'Afrique Occidentale. That's the French Company of West Africa. That's a company that was founded by French colonists in the 1880s in order to facilitate the extraction of goods and labor from the colonies in sub-Saharan West Africa. It is, of course, a company that enabled the colonization of that space, enabled the pilfering of many objects of value from that space. And so the kind of now concave-like mask that teeters on top of this little French blue wheelbarrow is actually a Fang people mask. And I'm showing you here on the right a photograph taken by Edward Weston in 1935 at the State Museums in Berlin, which was the repository for this very beautiful creation by the Fang peoples. This is a mask worn by only a very special few male members of Fang society for special ceremonies which were meant to illuminate mysteries. Martin changes it into the imprint of a face, rather, and this amazing scaffolding structure that holds it on top of something portable. The little blue wheelbarrow is an object he discovered on a farm not far away from Alexander Calder's house in the countryside of France. He had been there in the late 1990s doing a residency at the Calder Foundation and had discovered this farmer's wheelbarrow and had been quite taken by its beautiful structure and also by the beautiful way in which it had been painted, this lovely shade of very French blue. So this sculpture is one that one could imagine wheeling around, although it is a little top-heavy. But again, this idea of movement, migration, the movement of goods and the movement of people enters the work at this moment in the early mid-2000s when he began to work on it. That ghostly face is mirrored in a wall-based work behind it called Malediction. And this incredible form, whether it is in the shape of a kind of thought bubble or speech bubble, or whether it is an echo, a mirror of that Fang-like mask, right? It hangs off the wall with a wonderful sort of protrusion out of its chin, almost like it's the handle of a frying pan or the rudder of a boat. Is a remarkable, again, memory of that face-like form. And I think it begins to tell us again that these works can be many things for us at once. Maledictions are pronouncements, right? And so is this haunting face reminding us of past bad deeds? Is it pointing to the ways in which we might correct them? And it's also just miraculous to see in terms of its construction. Its beautiful way in which the artist has molded, carved, and put together the wood to make it. I think by 2010, when the artist had begun to work on this extraordinary big Phrygian, he was thinking both, again, of a kind of precarious liberty, and also always, again, of those soft, curved forms that read like sometimes the backs of animals or people. And so that if you enter the room from a certain direction, you see this work very differently than the shot that I'm showing you now, where it is in a way unmistakably the shape of the very thing the title calls it, a Phrygian cap. Phrygian caps are very distinctive headgear, and I think we've seen Martin signaling out specific types of hats already, but also maybe evoking other forms of headdress. And I'm just reminded that confessional, which I was just talking about, might also be like a kind of bonnet. Phrygian caps originated in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Phrygia, which is now present-day Anatolia or Turkey. They then became symbols of recently manumitted enslaved peoples in the Roman Empire, so that in Rome, if you saw someone wearing a Phrygian cap, you knew that they had at one time been enslaved, but now were no longer. It was then in the late 19th century when the French abolished slavery in their Caribbean colonies that it became a symbol of those recently manumitted peoples. And so here in a print, an engraving by Louis Darcy and Louis-Simon Boiseau from 1794, the very year of that abolishment, you see here a Haitian man wearing the Phrygian cap as a symbol of his newfound freedom, and the inscription, Moi libre aussi, I'm free too, has some really powerful meaning here. This was produced to commemorate that occasion and was also used as a decoration for porcelain plates. It's, of course, the Phrygian cap that we might remember on the head of La Marianne, as La Liberté guidant le peuple, liberty leading the people, over the barricades of July 1830 of that revolution in Paris that overthrew the Emperor Charles, and commemorated here in the famous painting by Eugène Delacroix. And so you see the Phrygian cap having this meaning of liberty, this meaning of freedom, but it depending on where and when, and it is different who is free and maybe who is not. It's also a work that made an appearance in the pavilion in Venice, and it's rather extraordinary contrast with Aso Oke, the other hat I began talking about at the beginning of the talk, and also its conjunction with a column for Sally Hemings in the pavilion there, and also now in our exhibition here, I think remind us of this painful history that we all would do well to remember. The story of Sally Hemings that Martin brings to us, reminds us of, evoked so powerfully now in this work, especially now that it's been remade in marble and cast iron. So for the 2021 version of A Column for Sally Hemings, the one that appears here in our exhibition, Martin had a very beautiful piece of white marble carved, and then he added his own elements to that carving because the tools that the quarry had in order to extract and then begin to make this shape for the artist were unable to, were not fine enough in order to create the amazing curve of the fluting that you see as it goes up and over the top of that skirt-like form, that column-like form, and into the aperture into which this cast iron shackle has been so almost crudely plunged. It is almost as if Sally Hemings is with us, with all of the contradictions about our fragile democracy that her memory might evoke. Jefferson himself being both, in a way, someone who believed deeply in freedom and liberty, but who enslaved hundreds. And that the experiment that this country began so many years ago and continues to this day is based so cruelly, so painfully on that legacy, is something that the artist put at the very center of his pavilion in Venice, his US pavilion in Venice, and which we wanted to remember in a profound way for our work with him here in Boston. The shackle that appears at the top of A Column for Sally Hemings is something that has also popped up in other recent works of the artist. And particularly in recent years, the artist has been doing some pretty remarkable work outside. So I wanted to remind folks, and we wanted to evoke this also in the exhibition, that particularly in the last 10 years, 15 years, the artist has been making extraordinary commissions for very specific places. Here I'm showing you a view of Big Bling as it was installed in Madison Square Park in New York City in 2016. Here, a kind of wonderful crouching animal-like form with a shackle as its kind of head or its nose or its eye. Perhaps it's something different altogether in your view. Sat in the park there for a number of months. It then traveled to Philadelphia, where it appeared in Fairmount Park, not far from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And it's now somewhere much closer at Mass MoCA in North Adams, Massachusetts, where you can go and see it today. Its extraordinary form, again, making use of this metal mesh to create a form that's both solid and transparent, that is able to be viewed, you can see right through it, but you also can't get inside of it, is an extraordinary reminder of all the ways in which those forms that the artist describes so beautifully in his work, part figurative, part abstract, appear again and again and again. There's also another work that we pay specific homage to in the exhibition through film, and we have on view in the Krupp Gallery adjacent to the show, where the exhibition continues, a beautiful little drawings cabinet that has some prints and one drawing by the artist, as well as the film that was made during the production of this spectacular work called Lookout at Storm King Art Center in the Hudson Valley, not far from Martin's own studio. It's here over the course of some years that the artist proposed and then built this extraordinary sculpture, this larger-than-life urn, bonnet, hat, planetarium, dome of vaulted brickwork, with apertures that give you glimpses of the landscape as you walk inside. It is an extraordinary object, the first work of Martin's made in brick, and I highly encourage you to visit Storm King and take this work in yourself. Second best is to watch the beautiful film made by Checkerboard Films that's on view upstairs. In the gallery, you get a real glimpse of the artist and his team and the Storm King team all at work together on this extraordinary thing, and it takes you from kind of conception of the project through the final launch of it in the summer of 2023. It's an extraordinary experience to visit, and I think now, finally, a work of Martin's that you can walk into, actually, right? One of these amazing volumes that you can now inhabit as a visitor. You can be both outside and inside of it. You can both look into it and look out of it, and see the ways in which these forms are from both outside and inside. I told you that Martin's forms return again and again in the work, and perched towards the end of our exhibition upstairs is now a snowy white version of On the Tundra, carved out of marble in 2022 by Puryear. Again, now some 40 years after the original. A white kind of ghost version, now the Greenland version, right, of the gyrfalcon, who sits in the gallery holding watch over this group of works from the last 20 years at the end of the show. And it's just remarkable to remember how this form, like so many of Martin's forms, returns again and again in the work, like a little ghost, like an old friend. And so it's so fantastic, I think, to discover and rediscover these forms. And do they change over the years? Do they take on new meanings as the years go by? Do they remind us of the past? Do they point the way to the future? And I'm also reminded, and this is something I shared yesterday at our opening events for Puryear, how absolutely this work reminds me how vital art is to tell us about our past, our present, and perhaps point the way to where we might go in the future. In this particularly difficult moment, to spend time with Puryear's work in its company, to kind of marvel at the artisanry, at the craft, at the beautiful handiwork that has wrought it, that has brought it into existence, its real sort of life force, the way it sort of moves in our space like living, breathing beings, the ways in which it carries with it so many meanings on its back, the ways in which it might liberate us from certain ways of thinking about what art might do, what it can do, and give us possibilities for all kinds of ways in which we might think about the world differently. For that, I'm so grateful to this extraordinary artist. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining me today, and I hope you'll be excited to visit the show again and again. It's on view here all the way through February 8th, I'm thrilled to say. And then, in a way that's so exciting for me, and I hope for you too, because it's always fun to see the ways in which exhibitions change as they travel, it will then go to the Cleveland Museum of Art in April of 2026. And then next autumn 2026, it will end up in Atlanta at the High Museum of Art. At each venue, it will also gain a few new works along the way because their exhibition spaces get bigger and bigger. And so it will be really fun, I think, to see the ways in which these works might change every time we visit them, even upstairs, the way we might look at them in a different light or different angle. And I think it's an extraordinary artist whose work can have so much meaning in such really simple ways, in beautiful gestures. And anyway, it's been a pleasure to share that with you today. I hope this has given you a little bit of a more background on the artist. Come back next week. My colleague, Michelle Miller-Fisher, will be presenting a deeper look at Martin Puryear's work with craft. For our marvelous exhibition catalog, Michelle took a really close look at the artist's time in Stockholm, Sweden, where he apprenticed with a famous cabinet maker. And so I know she'll come next week with many more insights into the ways in which these amazing objects have been constructed and the many kind of fascinating craft traditions that Martin has absorbed over the years all over the planet. So thanks, I'm really happy to take any questions you might have. Hi, yes.
I'm coming down with the
sorry,
microphone.
Please wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm wondering if Martin Puryear has a current printmaking practice.
I love that question. And it's also an opportunity for me to remind everybody that there's also works on paper in the show. And that is a rather unusual occurrence, I'd say, for a Puryear exhibition. We did a little bit of convincing to have the artist allow us to include a really carefully selected group of 15 works on paper in the exhibition. And Puryear, it's worth remembering that he started as a printmaker, right? So he went to study printmaking after his time in the Peace Corps in the 60s. There are some really early prints in the show. And every so often, well, I suppose rather, there's that spate of early printmaking. Upon his move from Sierra Leone to Stockholm. And then there's several decades where he did not go back to printmaking. And it's in the late 1990s that he was asked to illustrate the short stories of Jean Tucker, the Harlem Renaissance novelist, whose collection of short stories, Cain, that was published in 1927, was being reeditioned in a really beautiful artist book version. And Puryear did some fantastic woodblock prints to illustrate 7 of the female protagonists in Tucker's short stories. And so those are on view upstairs. And that, in a way, was his return to printmaking. And following that through the 90s and into the present, really, he continues to make really beautiful prints on occasion. So you see great examples upstairs, and particularly with Paulson Press, he's done some great editions. I don't know that he's done anything very recently, and I don't know that he has any plans to do anything, but I suppose what seems to have encouraged him to kind of make a print or an edition have been very particular occasions, right? So here's hoping there'll be some new prints, because they really are very, very beautiful and amazing objects in and of their own right. And you'll see them peppered throughout the exhibition. Any other questions?
It seems that you just mentioned collaborative work, and I'm wondering, I think his brother, Michael, is a woodworker and furniture maker, and I'm wondering if they've ever done collaborative work together.
That's a really good question. I don't believe so, although I know that they're close. The family in general is quite artistic, and I gather Martin's parents were encouraging of this for him and his siblings. You know, I'm vaguely remembering there might have been something, and you know that Puryear himself has dabbled in, well, not even dabbled, has made some beautiful furniture himself, right? So we actually have an example upstairs. Across from where the exhibition is located in a gallery that will soon be devoted to our contemporary craft collection. There's a kind of park bench type thing that was a form the artist originally developed for the courtyard of the New School for Social Research in Greenwich Village in New York. And that courtyard has been beloved by students of the New School for decades now. He also then editioned some of the furniture forms that he developed for that site, and this is one of them, a recent gift to the collection from one of our trustees. There's everything from beautiful stools to an extraordinary bench and reading room. If anyone's ever been to Glenstone Museum in Potomac, Maryland, there's a really beautiful library that Martin designed for the Railses who founded that museum, with an extraordinary piece of furniture in there that he designed. And so, like his brother, he's also made furniture. He is the ultimate bibliophile, and to visit him in the studio is often to get lost with him in the pages of a book, because he will readily grab things off the shelf to show you exactly what he's talking about. And the bookshelves just go on and on and on, from floor to ceiling, and it's an amazing place. Anything else? Up there, way up top.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. I'm just going to borrow actually a quote from John Chamberlain, that with anything that's abstract or any art that you question, which is what I did at first when I first saw his work, that it's not the work that changes, it's you, the observer. And that's what I felt like after this lecture, is now I am so excited about going in and seeing these sculptures. And thank you for the clarity and for the help to open my mind up. And thank you, and I look forward to next week's lecture.
Thank you so much. That's very meaningful, and I love that quote from John Chamberlain. That's amazing, and I suppose quite true, in a way. I suppose works of art can change over the years. They could fade, they could fall apart, right? They could change color sometimes. But it's true, isn't it? Most works, once they're finished, don't change all that much. But rather it's you as the viewer who brings to it what you bring, and who takes away from it what you take away, that might be changed. And I think that that's an amazing way to think about this artist's work, because I really do think that while amazingly rich and complex, beautifully wrought, right? Very difficult skills needed in order to build these things. There is a kind of effortlessness to them, a kind of stately presence, these kind of amazing forms that are really quite simple and beautiful gestures, right? That leave so much room for us to bring our experience, to bring our thoughts, to wonder at them, right? Because I think you can also go back, like any really great works of art, your thoughts about them change as you look at them, right? And as you come back and revisit them. So it really is a work that keeps on giving in extraordinary ways. And it was also such a pleasure, such an amazing thing to see the artist himself returning to these works that he had touched, right? So many of them had, left his studio years ago, right? He was talking about one that appears near the beginning of the show called Bound Cone. You'll know it when you see it, right? It's a cone-shaped form that's bound with rope. And it's now in the collection of the Toledo Museum of Art, but it had been in a private collection for decades. It had been something that Martin had shown at a gallery show in Washington, D.C. in 1980, had been purchased by a collector and went into their collection almost never to be seen again. And so for him to re-encounter this work almost 50 years after he made it was, I think, really special. But I think the same goes for anything in that show. He was looking so distinctly at all of these things that we had kind of gathered together for the project. And while, if you think about it, he may know it so intimately, know exactly what he did in order to make it, remember the choices that he made in the studio, how he was going to build it, what color it should be, what wood to use based on, the form it should take, that all might come rushing back, but that it might look different today than it did in the studio when he made it, just based on his own life experience too, right? So I love that. Thank you so much. Anything else? Any other parting thoughts? Thank you. Oh, one more.
Thank you so much. So after listening to you and after thinking about what you said about next time we come to talk about craft, there really is no difference between art and craft. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think that's fabulously right. I think, as Michelle speaks to so beautifully in her work, in her amazing career as a curator of contemporary craft, this is a sort of a false dichotomy, like so many in art history or in our day-to-day lives, right? Abstract, figurative, craft, art, it goes on and on and on. That there, yes, and I think one of the extraordinary things that this work reminds us is exactly that there is craft in art and there is art in craft. And that's one of the things that I love about my department here, actually, at the museum, that we do it all, including contemporary craft, right? So that we are all around the same table, paintings curators, sculpture curators, craft curators, drawings curators, time-based media curators, right? In our world, in our contemporary world, at least here at the MFA Boston, we do it all. Some photo, too. Yes, thank you so much. Thanks.